Good morning. It's great to be here and have the opportunity to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. And actually, I'm going to pick up where Dr. Phil, Alex. Left off and kind of actually end up right on the ground. And I'm going to preface my comments by emphasizing that I'm an academic, and as such, I'm reflecting my own views on the subject. Gauging from the content of the session this morning, I'm either going to be putting wind in your sails or putting fuel on the fire. So I'm just going to preface that by the hint is that TCU is thinking about what I'm going to talk about this morning. But my intention is not really to stir up anything. It's just to give a 30,000 feet conceptual view of just different ways of delivering employment services. So we'll see what you think. Oh, and I guess now I'm not used to such high-tech stuff. It works. Okay, so I'm going to work that way. So what I'm going to talk about today is the idea of policy gaps and local innovation. And I'm going to talk about why workforce development matters for Ontario communities and what you as urban policymakers can do about it. And our starting point is picking up from the theme of the conference is rather a simple and what I would argue quite a straightforward one. Your whole idea of whole child and whole community is simply this idea that parents and people who care for children are going to be able to care for their children better if they have access to family-sustaining, decent jobs. So that's kind of a simple starting point. And I think the entry point from a conceptual point of view and building on this notion of austerity is this idea of innovation. And in this current era of policy complexity, so at the same time as we're dealing with fiscal austerity and government unwillingness to address resources to these particular problems, we're seeing that these problems are becoming more complex, more interdependent, harder to solve in isolation. So my argument is we need new ideas. We need innovation. We need new ways of pooling our resources to get to address these issues. And what I kind of want to I want to make four main points throughout this talk. And the first is, following again on Alex's point, is that innovation is going to come from the bottom up. Don't be looking to federal and provincial governments, obviously, building on the last point. That's not where innovation is coming from. Innovation is coming from people at the urban level. And I'm also arguing that local approaches to workforce development, that is an innovative idea because it is certainly a departure from the previous policy context. And I also want to make the point that workforce development, the idea of pooling resources to come up with innovative ways of delivering employment services and getting people employed, it is difficult. I'm not going to make any promises about that, but it is possible. It is doable. And I'll also want to emphasize the fact that community capacity, the whole idea of building the ability of local actors to work together, is really critical to this approach to innovation, policy innovation. So what I'm going to situate my argument in four really important emerging trends. And the first is the growing importance of city regions. In the global economy, a lot of people predicted that cities would become less and less relevant, and that global processes and global knowledge flows, global economic flows would really make cities quite irrelevant. And what we found instead is that city regions are becoming more and more important locus of economic growth and social problems, but also social innovation. At the same time, there's a trend towards growing policy complexity. These are policy issues. Some people would call them wicked policy issues. They cross policy silos. They cross levels of government. They cross public, private, and community spheres of influence. And these are problems that can't be addressed in isolation. And we're also seeing the emergence now of new forms of what I'm calling urban governance. And this is ways that people at the local level, again, crossing levels of government, crossing policy sectors, crossing public, private, and community-based sectors, are working together to come up with innovative responses to the problems that they face. And one really interesting emerging trend is this idea that social equity and economic development, those ideas need to be integrated at the local level. If we just emphasize economic development, it's not going to take our regions very far. And this is an idea that really resonates in the community economic development literature in the US, but it's also an idea that we're starting to see more and more in the Canadian context. And basically what we're talking about, the kind of the urban policy challenge I'm going to focus on today, is this issue of if too many people are stuck on the wrong side of the talent divide. And in a knowledge-intensive economy, people who are highly educated and have high levels of knowledge and skills have great, high-paying, secure jobs. Well, that's a different, not necessarily secure, but good and high-paying jobs. But the people who are the most vulnerable, the least connected to the mainstream. This is Neil Bradford's point. And this whole idea that increasing income polarization obviously is going to lead to social polarization. There's been some interesting research. I think probably many of you are familiar with David Holchansky's research in Toronto that comes up with the 3 cities in Toronto and growing income and social polarization in Canadian communities. But this idea that we can't have islands of prosperity in a sea of poverty. Inequality can drag down the whole region. So this whole idea that is linking social innovation, social equity with economic growth is gaining a lot more attention. So if we're going to talk about Ontario, clearly any of you who work with obviously vulnerable populations employment services know that Ontario's labour market has been going through some important periods of transition, probably since the early 80s. And there are several trends affecting Ontario's labour market. The first is economic restructuring and recession. Ontario is a mature manufacturing economy, and there are a lot of those middle-class, stable, good-paying, relatively semi-skilled jobs have gone. And so there's been the shift to knowledge-intensive production and a loss of these solid jobs. And this has just been exacerbated by recession. Obviously, this is felt differently in different communities. Some places like Windsor, Oshawa are feeling it, St. Catharines feeling it more harshly than others. But this is definitely a labour market issue that Ontario is facing. The other one, and this is probably something you see again every day, is this idea of mismatch in labour markets. We hear lots of talk about aging out of the workforce and how are we going to replace, the loss of skilled workers in the workforce. But we're also seeing real big, deep problems with youth and immigrant integration into labour markets. So young people, even college and university educated people, are having trouble integrating into the labour force, let alone people who don't have high school educations. So there's that, and I think all of you, as I've seen some of the literature out there, this issue of immigrant integration is also very topical. But also, you're seeing, as the loss of stable middle-wage jobs, you're seeing this rise in precarious low-wage jobs, this whole idea that people have to work for 2 and 3 jobs, this whole idea of the working poor. People have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to feed their families. And it's interesting, this is for an American audience, this particular slide, that one of the big issues that a lot of people are advocating for in the States is a decent minimum wage. And I was quite surprised to hear my brother-in-law has a friend who runs a restaurant in Detroit. And I found out through him that there is really no minimum wage. And people who are serving in restaurants in Detroit are making $3 and $4 an hour. So tip well. So this whole idea of precarious low-wage jobs. And finally, we're seeing, as we see these, in terms of austerity measures, cut back on income support, cut back on social assistance, loss of decent jobs, we're seeing problems with growing poverty and homelessness and people who are finding themselves permanently on the wrong side of the talent divide. And this I don't need to tell you about too much because you work with people in this situation every day. So one of the big arguments, and this is where the going out on limb part starts, is I've argued that throughout this time, at the same time, there's been a major policy gap in Ontario. There's been a huge labour market policy gap in Ontario. Most of you will be aware is that Ontario in the mid-1990s was the only province not to sign a labour market development agreement with the federal government. And as a result, from the mid-1990s onwards, there was no strategic policy framework. And there was weak and patchy programs, duplication, overlap of federal, provincial, and municipal efforts delivered by different ministries in different ways through different programs. So basically, there was a policy vacuum, not a lot of things going on. And since 2007, since the LMDA and the LMA was signed at the same time, there's been a lot more consolidation of the programs, but the effort's been on internal bureaucratic reorganization and not so much on where it really needs to be. So I argue that there's been little policy innovation, little attention to new ways to deliver employment services, little attention to ways to integrate employment service delivery across different ministries and different levels of government, and especially little attention to the important local dimension of labor market planning. So what I argue is that workforce development operates at the nexus of a lot of these different trends that I've been talking about. It operates at the nexus of social welfare, social equity, and economic development. It also operates at the nexus of federal, provincial, and local governments and across policy sectors. So just giving a quick overview of what I'm talking about workforce development, it's inherently based on principles of inclusive community economic development. And again, so intrinsically linking up this equity and economic efficiency argument. It's also based on this idea that labor markets are inherently local. People typically, they live and work in the same region. So it makes sense to build programs and strategic planning that's regionally sensitive. So it makes sense to build programs for jobs that actually exist. And that's part of the next point, is that it matches supply and demand in local labor markets. So in other words, it builds career pathways to family-sustaining jobs that actually exist. It doesn't make a lot of sense to provide training and education programs for jobs that don't exist in the local economy. But I think the key point of this, too, is it matches supply and demand. So in other words, it's linking, not just training people, but it's linking them with jobs and employers in the local economy. And it also emphasizes integrated service delivery, okay? So the idea of providing not just education and training, but wraparound supports to people who need to transition into the labor market and to stay there. They often need other supports as well: housing, childcare, income support, and this whole idea of individualized programming, finding ways to deliver programming to people that fit their individual needs. But perhaps the most important point that I want to make about workforce development is that it is a comprehensive, networked, and interventionist approach to local planning and local service delivery. So therefore, it requires collaborative, multi-stakeholder, local cross-sector intermediaries that join up labor market actors. So what I mean by cross-sector, well, I'll get to that. But in other words, it's pretty straightforward, right? This whole idea of getting people to work together, this whole idea of collaboration at the local level. That's my herding cats picture. That's the hard part. Coordinating the interests and efforts of local labor market stakeholders, that's the hard part. We actually know quite a bit about what works in local workforce development, what works, what doesn't, and why. So in other words, how to actually do it. It's just getting people, or different stakeholders, to work together. That's the challenging part. As Susan Clark puts it, someone who's done work on workforce development in the States, that workforce development issues are intrinsically governance issues because they require people to work together who are interdependent, complex, and loosely linked, but they might have shared purposes, so they might want the same thing, but they have no shared authority. So in other words, nothing to actually bring them together. So it's underscoring the voluntary nature of local collaboration. So if we're talking about local labor market actors in Ontario, this is a kind of a way to map out the universe here. If you see on the left-hand side, there are many different organizations that deliver social and employment services in Ontario crossing. And this is not exhaustive. You could probably think up more that I haven't actually got here. But this idea of municipal government, so through Ontario Works and housing, the social assistance, the TCU at the local level, which delivers apprenticeship training, Service Canada offering income supports, the local training board, which integrates lots of different labor market actors. The local community college offers career pathways, English as a second language training. The Board of Education, again, adult education. Employment service agencies, huge actors. Unions, community-based organizations like the United Way, the social planning councils, these kinds, the YMCA, immigrant settlement organizations. So there's all kinds of different community-based organizations, some government-funded, some not-for-profit, operating in the employment service delivery field at the local level. On the right side, the economic development, again, municipal government, the Economic Development Office of the Municipal Government, Chambers of Commerce, local business associations, and most importantly, employers. So there's this whole universe, this whole ecosystem that operates at the local level that's made up of all these different actors. The problem is they don't always, sometimes they do, but they don't really always pull it off together. And this is drawn from my research. I looked at workforce development efforts in 3 Ontario cities, and I was kind of interested in the absence of government policy encouraging this to happen. Will it actually happen? And people said, oh, don't bother doing that. Like without provincial policy framework, without a federal policy framework, you're not going to find anything. Well, I actually found quite a bit. And even in the 3 cities I looked at, there were voluntary labor market workforce development strategies had existed in all 3 cities, but there was tremendous variation in how successful they were, who was involved, how different local actors were involved. And there are some communities in Ontario that have gone quite a ways down this road, but there are other ones who really have never gotten out of the blocks. Other things that I found, and I think this is a really key point for you to take away, which you probably already know, but this idea that policymakers could kind of push back and say they perceive, well, you guys can't get your own house in order. We just see you competing with each other, not collaborating. So, and there was one really interesting interview I had. She said, I talked to the Minister of Training Colleges and Universities and said, we need support to get to collaborate and to build collaborative mechanisms at the local level. He says, well, you organize yourselves and get back to me, and then maybe we'll talk about giving you some support. So there's this catch-22, which is a really important point. It's also hard to keep it on the municipal policy agenda. People don't quite get what's workforce development. It's not nice and tidy. It's not sexy. It's kind of a difficult issue for people to get their head around. And ultimately, employer engagement, which is absolutely critical for workforce development, for planning, program design, and placement. It's extremely difficult to sustain employer engagement. So notes from the trenches, I think, just kind of underscore this point of this catch-22 between a rock and a hard place. And that there isn't policy around there driving communities. Policymakers aren't saying, what do you guys need? Let us know, and we'll kind of come up with a plan together. In other words, the argument I'm trying to make here is that don't rely on federal and provincial governments to solve your problems. Innovation does really need to come from the ground up at the local level. And I think this is kind of building on an idea that it's kind of uncomfortable in Canada. There's this whole idea that municipal governments are service delivery agents. They just kind of, they don't really have any constitutional status. They don't have much local autonomy to do much of anything, and therefore they just deliver services that are funded by other levels of government. And what we're finding more and more in the literature and more on the ground is that there's this whole shift towards seeing municipal governments also as urban policymakers and becoming much more activist in ways of solving their own problems. And this underscores the importance of building community capacity. And how am I doing for time? Okay? Okay. So I'm just going to go through this quickly, just this idea that the idea of blending public and private resources to build policy capacity at the urban level. The idea that communities with a richer blend of services and more complex networks are not only more inclusive, but they're also more efficient in terms of delivering services. And this idea of horizontal collaboration to see like a community and leverage combined insights, actions, and I would also add different resources. So the idea is that we need to build intermediaries across sectors between people who are not really necessarily used to working together, may not even know each other, to connect unemployed people with career pathways to decent jobs. So they need to be inclusive. Local government needs to be at the table, TCU needs to be at the table, employment service providers and employers need to be at the table. It needs to be sustainable. This is not a one-off project partnership. This is something that needs to be sustainable over the long term, and it needs to perform. You actually need to do something. You don't just form a network. You actually have to do something. So you need activist local governments. You need this isn't just senior staff. This is also politicians, getting mayor and council involved, cross-sector civic leadership, both from community-based organizations and the business sector, and collaboration within and across your networks, not just your social service delivery networks. You need to be collaborating within, but also across with business networks. And you need mechanisms to engage employers. And then you might just get policy attention and support, and you might not. But if you don't, what have you got to lose? So in terms of, so you say it can't be done, there are many examples of this happening in other places in very successful ways, and certainly in Ontario, immigrant integration partnerships, that was scaled up from the local level. Poverty reduction and neighborhood revitalization are some examples. And also workforce development is gathering momentum at other places. The Drummond Report, the Social Assistance Review emphasizes it. OMSSA has done some policy work. The Wellesley Institute and the City of Toronto has recently launched or has come up with a workforce development strategy. So in a nutshell, what I want to take away from this is that community capacity matters, and that you, as urban activists and urban policymakers, have an important role to play in building community capacity, because it matters for policy innovation. It matters for integrated employment service delivery, for strategic labor market policy or planning, workforce development, and for diversity, social justice, and equity. So thanks very much, and I don't think herding cats is quite as difficult as we would think.